The fluorescent lights of Oak Haven Elementary's third-grade classroom hummed a monotonous, soul-leeching tune. It was a sound Sarah Jenkins had come to associate with quiet desperation. Her own and that of the small boy sitting by the window. Leo Thorne was a ghost in a room of brightly colored, chattering children. He existed in the periphery, a smudge of worn denim and faded gray hoodies. His presence defined more by his silence than by any action. While other kids shouted answers and waved their hands with frantic energy, Leo hunched over a tattered notebook, his pencil moving with a quiet, intense precision. He wasn't doodling monsters or cars. He was drawing engines, intricate and complex, the gleaming chrome and shadowed pistons rendered with an understanding that seemed far beyond his 8 years. Today, the lunchtime bell had rung, unleashing a cacophony of rustling paper bags and snapping plastic lunchbox lids. The scent of peanut butter, apple juice, and processed cheese filled the air. It was a ritual of childhood normalcy that Leo was never a part of. As always, he remained at his desk, his notebook his only companion. He would stare out the window at the gnarled oak tree in the schoolyard, his expression unreadable, his stomach audibly rumbling in the brief lulls of conversation. The other children, in the casually cruel way of the young, had already learned the town's script. They would whisper, their words sharp little daggers. "That's the biker kid. My dad says his dad's in jail. He's weird." They gave him a wide berth, as if his silence were a communicable disease. Sarah watched from her desk, a familiar ache tightening in her chest. She had seen this kind of isolation before, a quiet suffering that most adults were too busy or too callous to notice. It was in the way Leo's shoulders slumped, the way his eyes, a startlingly clear shade of blue, seemed to hold the weight of a life far too heavy for a child. He never complained, never asked for anything. He simply endured. Today, the endurance felt particularly sharp. He hadn't eaten yesterday either, she remembered. He'd told her he wasn't hungry, a lie so transparent it was heartbreaking. She couldn't stand it another second. Her own lunch, a simple turkey sandwich and an apple, suddenly felt like a feast of obscene decadence. Pushing back her chair, she walked over to his desk, her sensible shoes making soft, apologetic sounds on the linoleum. The whispers from the other tables tapered off, replaced by curious stares. Leo didn't look up until her shadow fell across his drawing. He flinched, quickly closing the notebook as if protecting a sacred text. "Leo," Sarah said, her voice gentle. "I packed too much today. My eyes were bigger than my stomach." She placed her brown paper bag on the corner of his desk. "I'd hate for it to go to waste. Would you mind helping me out?" He finally looked up at her. His eyes were wide with a mixture of shock, suspicion, and a deep, gut-wrenching flicker of hope. He stared at the bag, then back at her. His lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came out. The judgment from the surrounding desks was a palpable force, a wave of unspoken condemnation. Sarah ignored it. She held his gaze, offering a small, encouraging smile. Slowly, hesitantly, like a wild animal approaching a tentative hand, he reached out and pulled the bag toward him. His small, slightly grimy fingers trembled as they unwrapped the sandwich. He didn't thank her, not with words, but as he took the first ravenous bite, his eyes closed for a brief second, and in that moment, Sarah saw all the gratitude she would ever need. It was a silent, profound acknowledgement that for the first time in a long time, someone had truly seen him. The next morning, a small glass jar appeared on Sarah's desk with a neatly printed label, "Classroom Lunch Fund." It was her quiet solution, a way to help Leo without singling him out. She dropped in a folded $20 bill, hoping to create a discreet safety net for any child who might need it. The gesture, however, was anything but discreet to Mark Renshaw, a man whose wealth was matched only by his arrogance. Renshaw was the president of the local business council, a prominent member of the school board, and the father of Aiden, a boy who treated the classroom as his personal fiefdom. He arrived after the final bell, striding into her classroom without knocking. He was a vision of tailored privilege, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the colorful, chaotic world of a third-grade room. He didn't bother with pleasantries. His eyes, cold and dismissive, immediately locked onto the jar. "Ms. Jenkins," he began, his voice a low, condescending drawl. "I've received some concerns about your extracurricular fundraising." He picked up the jar, rattling the single bill inside. "What exactly is this for?" Sarah felt a prickle of defensive anger. "It's a fund for students who forget their lunch money, Mr. Renshaw, to make sure everyone has something to eat." Renshaw let out a short, humorless laugh. "Let's not be naive. We both know who this is for." He gestured vaguely toward Leo's empty desk by the window. "It's for the Thorn boy. You're running a charity for the son of a career criminal." The accusation hung in the air, thick and ugly. "Leo is an 8-year-old child," Sarah said, her voice level despite the tremor in her hands. "His family situation is not his fault, and he deserves to eat lunch, the same as any other student." "Deserves?" Renshaw sneered, placing the jar back on her desk with a contemptuous thud. "That family is a blight on this town. His father, Rook Thorn, is the leader of that degenerate motorcycle gang. They deal in violence and filth. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, Ms. Jenkins. By enabling that boy, you're telling him his lifestyle is acceptable. You're rewarding delinquency." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You're new here. You don't understand how things work in Oakhaven. We don't coddle trash. It sends the wrong message." His words were a physical blow. She saw the town's insular nature for what it was. A fortress built to keep people like Leo out. Before she could form a response, Principal Thompson appeared in the doorway, drawn by the raised voices. He was a man perpetually hunched, as if apologizing for his own existence, his expression a permanent mask of weary anxiety. "Mark, is there a problem here?" he asked, his eyes darting nervously between the imposing parent and the new teacher. Renshaw straightened up, his demeanor shifting to one of aggrieved civic duty. "I was just expressing my concern to Ms. Jenkins about school resources being used to subsidize the children of undesirable elements. It's a matter of policy and, frankly, a matter of community standards." Principal Thompson wilted under Renshaw's glare. He wrung his hands, avoiding Sarah's gaze. "Ah, yes. Well, Ms. Jenkins," he stammered. "Perhaps Mr. Renshaw has a point. Our budget is tight. We must encourage personal responsibility. Please stick to the approved curriculum. We can't get involved in the students' personal lives." It was a complete capitulation, a dismissal not just of her actions, but of a child's basic needs. Sarah stood in the sudden silence of her classroom, the smell of chalk dust and Renshaw's expensive cologne mingling in the air. She was being told to unsee what she had seen, to ignore the silent plea in a hungry boy's eyes. As Renshaw gave her one last triumphant smirk and walked out, she knew this was more than a disagreement. It was a line drawn in the sand, and she had no intention of backing down. That night, sleep offered Sarah no respite. The sterile, beige walls of her small rental house felt like they were closing in, mirroring the suffocating judgment of Oakhaven. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the confrontation with Renshaw playing on a loop in her mind. His sneering dismissal of Leo as trash echoed with the ghosts of her own past. She saw the face of her younger brother, Daniel. He had been quiet, too. A gentle, artistic soul in a family that valued noise and athletic prowess. He'd been overlooked, his anxieties dismissed as shyness, his passions seen as frivolous. Sarah had been his champion, his only real confidant. She remembered the day he died with a clarity that still stole her breath. A stupid, preventable accident. A fall from a poorly maintained set of bleachers at a high school football game everyone had pressured him to attend. He hadn't wanted to go. He'd wanted to stay home and work on his clay sculptures. But their father had insisted he'd be more normal. Sarah had been away at her college orientation. She got the call in her dorm room. A sterile, impersonal conversation that had shattered her world into a million pieces. The guilt was a constant companion, a cold stone in her gut. If she had been there, she would have defended him. She would have told their father to leave him alone. She would have stayed home with him. She would have seen the danger. That failure to protect him became the defining force of her life. It was why she became a teacher. She had vowed to be the adult she'd needed in her own youth. The one who saw the quiet ones, the different ones, the ones who were slowly being erased by the world's indifference. Leo Thorne, with his haunted blue eyes and his secret world of motorcycle engines, was a reflection of the brother she had lost. He was another quiet soul in danger of being crushed by a world that refused to understand him. Renshaw's cruelty wasn't just an attack on a student. It was a desecration of the vow she had made to Daniel's memory. Getting out of bed, she walked to the kitchen and began making lunch for the next day. She made 2 sandwiches, not one. 2 apples. 2 juice boxes. She packed them into 2 separate brown paper bags. Her hands were steady, her movements deliberate. This was no longer just about feeding a hungry child. It was an act of defiance. It was a promise. She would not be the person who looked away. She would not let another quiet boy be broken by neglect. The principal's warning, Renshaw's threats, the town's scorn. They all faded into irrelevant noise. All that mattered was the quiet, 8-year-old boy who would be waiting at his desk tomorrow. She would be there for him, a small, unwavering beacon in the lonely landscape of his childhood. Her resolve hardened into something unbreakable, forged in the fires of past grief and present injustice. She would not fail again. Renshaw, true to his nature, did not let the matter rest. His campaign against Sarah escalated from a private confrontation to a public crusade. He began by planting seeds of doubt among the other parents. Whispers started in the grocery store aisles and at the post office. "Did you hear about the new teacher? She's playing favorites. I heard she's encouraging that Thorne boy's bad behavior. She's bringing her liberal city politics into our school." The narrative was insidious, twisting an act of compassion into one of professional misconduct and poor judgment. Hostile emails began to fill Sarah's inbox, filled with anonymous, poison-tipped questions about her agenda and her qualifications. A few parents, emboldened by Renshaw's social standing, formally requested their children be moved from her class. The classroom, once a sanctuary of learning, started to feel like a fishbowl. Other teachers, friends she thought she had made, began to avoid her in the staff lounge, offering tight, apologetic smiles before scurrying away. The isolation was a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders. Principal Thompson now communicated with her only through terse, formal memos, his cowardice on full display. Yet, amidst the growing storm, a tiny island of peace formed around desk number 12. Leo, sensing he was at the center of the conflict, seemed to draw into himself even further in the presence of others. But with Sarah, a fragile trust was blooming. He continued to accept the lunch she offered him each day, his silent gratitude a powerful antidote to the town's venom. One afternoon, during silent reading, he brought his notebook to her desk. He opened it not to the engine drawings, but to a new page. On it was a detailed sketch of a flower, a tiger lily, its petals shaded with an artist's care. "It's for you," he whispered, the words so soft she barely heard them. "Because you're nice." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. "Leo, it's beautiful. You're a very talented artist." A faint blush colored his cheeks. He pointed to his usual drawings of V-twin engines and chrome exhaust pipes. "My dad taught me how to draw," he said, his voice filled with a quiet, fierce pride. "He says you have to see all the parts to understand the whole thing. How it all works together." It was the most he had ever spoken about his family. He never called him Dad, only he, and he spoke of him in the present tense. A man who was an active, if absent, part of his life. This small connection became Sarah's lifeline. It was a reminder of why she was enduring the town's hostility. It was for this boy, this brilliant, lonely, resilient child. But Renshaw was not finished. He leveraged his position on the school board to call for a formal performance review. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday night in the school auditorium. It wasn't a review. It was a trial. The charge was unprofessional conduct, and the verdict, Sarah knew, was already decided. The pressure was immense. She felt like she was standing on a shoreline, watching a tidal wave of hatred roll in, with nowhere to run. The community, the very people she was there to serve, had already judged and convicted her. And she was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The school auditorium buzzed with the self-righteous energy of a witch hunt. The air was thick with cheap perfume and the scent of microwaved popcorn from the concession stand, a bizarrely festive atmosphere for a public shaming. Nearly 100 people, parents, town officials, curious onlookers, filled the worn velvet seats. Sarah stood near the side of the stage, her hands clutching a single sheet of paper with her prepared notes, though she knew they were useless. This wasn't about facts, it was about power. On the stage, Mark Renshaw sat with the other 4 board members, looking smug and triumphant. Principal Thompson sat slightly apart from them, looking as if he were about to be physically ill. Renshaw began the proceedings, his voice booming with false sincerity. He spoke of maintaining standards, protecting the learning environment, and addressing parental concerns. He then presented a file, a so-called report filled with anonymous, out-of-context complaints and fabricated incidents. He painted Sarah as a radical, an outsider with a dangerous agenda who was disrupting the town's values. He spoke of Leo Thorne not by name, but as the student from a known criminal element, framing Sarah's kindness as a reckless endangerment of the other children. When it was her turn to speak, a hush fell over the room. Every eye was on her. She walked to the podium, her legs feeling like lead, her heart hammered against her ribs. She looked out at the sea of faces, some hostile, some smug, some merely indifferent. She saw no allies. In the back, she caught a flash of movement. It was Leo, half hidden behind a pillar, his small face pale with worry. He shouldn't have been there, but seeing him, so small and so alone, extinguished the fear in her heart and replaced it with a white-hot flame of purpose. She pushed her useless notes aside. "My name is Sarah Jenkins," she began, her voice shaking but clear, amplified by the microphone. "I am a teacher. My job is to educate. But that job does not begin at 8:15 and end at 3:30. It does not stop at the edge of a textbook." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the board members, finally landing on Renshaw. "My job is to see children. All of them. The loud ones, the popular ones, and especially the quiet ones. The ones who come to school with invisible burdens that you cannot measure on a standardized test. Last week," she continued, "I saw a child who was hungry. I didn't see a criminal element. I didn't see a problem. I saw a little boy who hadn't eaten. And I gave him my sandwich." The simplicity of the statement hung in the air, a stark contrast to Renshaw's bloated rhetoric. "I am accused of unprofessional conduct. But I ask you, what is our profession if it does not have room for basic human decency? A child's hunger is not a disciplinary issue. It is not a political issue. It is a human 1-inch. She took a deep breath, her voice gaining strength. If providing a sandwich to a hungry 8-year-old is a violation of this school's policy, if standing up for a child who has no one else to stand up for him is grounds for dismissal, then I have nothing left to defend. I will not apologize for my actions. I accept your judgment." She stepped back from the podium, her dignity a silent, unbreachable shield. She hadn't begged. She hadn't pleaded. She had simply spoken the truth. In the back of the room, Leo watched her, his wide, tear-filled eyes shining with a fierce, protective pride. He wasn't just her student anymore. She was his hero. Sarah's final words settled over the auditorium like a fine dust, changing the very quality of the air. The smug certainty on many faces began to crumble, replaced by a flicker of doubt, then shame. They had come expecting a spectacle, a satisfying takedown of an arrogant outsider. Instead, they had witnessed an act of quiet, unshakable integrity. A low murmur rippled through the crowd, a collective cognitive dissonance. The woman at the podium didn't look like the monster from Renshaw's rumors. She looked like a teacher, a good one. A woman in the 3rd row, who ran the town's only diner, turned to her husband. "His mother died of cancer 2 years back," she whispered. her voice tight with emotion. I remember her. Sweet girl. His father. He just sort of disappeared after that, the whisper spread, passed from one person to another like a secret password. Rook Thorn. He's not in jail. I heard he went to take care of his own father, who's sick. The carefully constructed narrative of the delinquent family began to fray at the edges. People started to look at Mark Renshaw, at his expensive suit and his cruel smirk, and then back at Sarah, standing alone and defiant, and they began to see the situation for what it was. A wealthy bully trying to crush a decent woman. The whispers grew, no longer of condemnation for Sarah, but of a dawning, uncomfortable respect. It was in this moment of shifting sentiment, just as the board chairman cleared his throat to call for a vote, that a new sound intruded. It started as a low, distant thrum, a vibration felt more in the bones than heard with the ears. It was a sound alien to the quiet, orderly world of a school board meeting. The thrum grew steadily, resolving itself into the distinct, guttural growl of multiple large displacement engines. It wasn't the sound of a few motorcycles. It was the sound of an army. The rumble swelled, shaking the very windows of the auditorium, a wave of pure, mechanical thunder that drowned out every other noise. Every head in the room turned toward the main entrance. The heavy double doors, which had been propped open to let in the cool night air, swung inward as if pushed by a gust of wind. But it wasn't the wind. The doorway was filled with men. A wall of them. They were huge, clad in worn leather and faded denim, their faces etched with the hardness of the road. Their vests, their cuts, were adorned with a menacing patch, a coiled iron serpent, fangs bared. The Iron Serpent's motorcycle club. They didn't storm in. They simply occupied the space, their presence an overwhelming statement of intent. They numbered at least 30, with more visible in the parking lot beyond, the chrome of their bikes glinting under the security lights. At their head stood a man who seemed carved from mountain granite. He was immense, with a thick, graying beard and arms corded with muscle. His eyes, dark and intelligent, swept across the stunned room, missing nothing. He was Breaker, the club's vice president, Rook Thorn's most trusted man. His gaze passed over the terrified board members, the gaping crowd, and Sarah. It finally landed on the small figure of Leo, still hiding behind the pillar. The boy, who had been frozen in fear, broke into a run. "Breaker!" he cried, his voice cutting through the shocked silence. He threw himself against the giant's leg. Breaker knelt, the leather of his pants groaning, and placed a massive, tattooed hand on Leo's shoulder. The gesture was one of profound, gentle protection. He looked at Leo, then his eyes rose and met Sarah's. There was no menace in his gaze, not for her. It was a look of deep, unnerving appraisal, of weighing and measuring. The room held its breath, suspended in the silent, idling thunder of 50 Harley-Davidson engines. The world had just tilted on its axis. Breaker left one of his men, a younger biker named Stitch, with Leo at the back of the auditorium before he started toward the stage. He moved with a slow, deliberate gait that radiated absolute confidence. The crowd parted for him as if he were royalty, their fear a palpable thing. He didn't stomp or swagger. His worn leather boots made a soft, rhythmic scuff on the floor, a sound far more menacing than any shout could have been. He ignored the board members, who had shrunk in their chairs, and walked directly to the podium Sarah had just vacated. He rested his hands on its sides, his knuckles scarred and thick, and surveyed the room. The silence was now absolute, broken only by the distant, throbbing idle of the bikes outside, a promise of contained power. "My name is Breaker," he said, his voice a low baritone that needed no microphone. It rumbled through the auditorium, carrying an authority that Renshaw's manufactured outrage could never touch. "I'm the vice president of the Iron Serpents. And that boy back there," he pointed a thumb over his shoulder toward Leo, "is Leo Thorn. His father is Rook Thorn. Our president." He let the words hang in the air, allowing the town's most feared name to settle over them. "I hear a lot of stories in this town," Breaker continued, his eyes scanning the faces in the crowd, lingering for a moment on Renshaw. Gossip. Lies. Most of it ain't worth the breath it takes to tell it. I hear people say Rook's in prison. That he abandoned his kid. He shook his head slowly. Rook's father, Leo's grandfather, is dying. A cancer that's eating him from the inside out. Rook has been by his side for the last 3 months, holding his hand, helping him find some peace at the end. That's the kind of man he is. A man who honors his blood. He explained that Rook had left Leo in the care of his elderly aunt, who lived just outside Oakhaven. What they hadn't known, what the aunt had been too proud and too ill to admit, was that her own health had failed precipitously. She had developed pneumonia, leaving her bedridden and unable to properly care for a growing boy. She did her best, Breaker said, his voice softening for a moment. But she was sick. And Leo's a good kid. He didn't want to be a burden, so he kept quiet. He tried to handle it himself. Breaker then turned his gaze directly to Sarah. It was an intense, searching look, devoid of any artifice. "We have a prospect," he said, nodding toward a clean-shaven young man standing guard by the door. "His daughter is in this school." She told him about a teacher who saw a quiet kid was hungry and fed him, who kept feeding him even when people told her to stop, who stood up here tonight and put her own job on the line for him. He took a step toward her. "You stood for Rook's boy when this whole town looked the other way. When this man," he jabbed a finger toward a now-ashen Renshaw, "tried to make an example of him. The Iron Serpents have a long memory, Ms. Jenkins. We don't forget our enemies. And we damn sure never forget our friends." The truth, delivered in that calm, unwavering voice, was more devastating than any threat. It stripped away the lies, exposed the petty cruelty, and rearranged the moral landscape of the entire room. Mark Renshaw, who had built his life on intimidation and influence, was now reduced to a pale, sweating mess. He tried to regain control, to bluster his way through the new reality. "Now, see here," he began, his voice a pathetic squeak. "This is a school board meeting. You have no right." Breaker didn't even turn his head. He simply raised his hand, a gesture that was not a request, but a command. Silence. The sheer, unadulterated power in that small movement was terrifying. The bikers lining the walls didn't move a muscle, but their collective stare bore down on Renshaw. 100 years of road-hardened judgment focused on one man. He wilted, sinking back into his chair, his face the color of spoiled milk. The bikers didn't need to lay a hand on him. Their presence was a judgment in itself, a silent promise that his world of casual cruelty had just collided with a world of absolute consequences. The board meeting dissolved without a vote. The members mumbled apologies and scurried off the stage, avoiding eye contact with everyone. The crowd dispersed quickly and quietly, their earlier bravado gone, replaced by a humbled, fearful respect. The next morning, when Sarah arrived at the school, the first thing she noticed was her car. The 2 tires that had been perpetually low on air were gone, as were the other 2. In their place were 4 brand-new, top-of-the-line radials, gleaming black against the dusty asphalt. A quick glance at her fuel gauge showed the tank, which had been near empty, was now full. Inside, on her desk, the classroom lunch fund jar sat in its usual spot. But it was no longer empty. It was stuffed to the brim with neatly folded bills. Peeking out from the top were the corners of several $100 bills. Next to the jar sat a small object, a serpent intricately carved from a single piece of dark, polished wood. It was coiled as if ready to strike, its tiny eyes seeming to watch over the room. It was a token, a symbol. It was a shield. Later that morning, Principal Thompson appeared at her door, his face a mask of frantic apology. "Ms. Jenkins, Sarah," he stammered, wringing his hands. "About the review. It's been canceled, of course. A complete misunderstanding. A terrible, terrible mistake." He couldn't meet her eyes. His fear of the bikers had miraculously cured him of his spinelessness, at least where she was concerned. The rest of the day was surreal. Teachers who had shunned her now offered her coffee. Parents who had sent angry emails gave her sheepish waves in the pickup line. The town, humbled and ashamed, was recalibrating its allegiances. News traveled fast in Oakhaven. Mark Renshaw's construction company had 2 major municipal contracts mysteriously canceled that morning for unforeseen administrative issues. His reign was over. Sarah Jenkins, the quiet outsider, was now under the unstated but absolute protection of the Iron Serpents. A few weeks passed. A fragile peace settled over Oakhaven, and a new routine settled into Sarah's classroom. The whispers about Leo had stopped completely, replaced by a careful, almost fearful respect. The other children, sensing the shift in the adult world, began to include him in their games. He was still quiet, but his shoulders were no longer slumped. He smiled more. The haunted look in his eyes was slowly being replaced by the simple, uncomplicated light of childhood. Sarah continued to pack an extra lunch, but now, more often than not, Leo would arrive with his own, packed in a new lunchbox with a serpent emblem on the front. One sunny afternoon, as Sarah was supervising recess, the familiar rumble of a single motorcycle echoed down the street. It was a different sound from the thunder of the club's arrival. This was a deeper, more refined growl. A gleaming motorcycle, a classic panhead chopper, pulled up to the school curb. It was a work of art, its black paint polished to a mirror shine, its chrome engine parts looking exactly like the intricate drawings in Leo's notebook. The rider dismounted in one fluid motion. He was tall and lean, wearing a worn leather cut identical to the others, but his carried the patch of President. He took off his helmet, revealing a sharp, intelligent face with kind, tired eyes that were the exact same shade of blue as his son's. This was Rook Thorne. He wasn't the monster of the town's imagination. He was just a man who looked like he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. Leo saw him and let out a shout of pure joy. "Dad!" He sprinted across the schoolyard and launched himself into his father's arms. Rook caught him, hugging him tightly, burying his face in the boy's hair. After a long moment, Rook set Leo down and they walked towards Sarah. He was imposing, but his presence was calm, not menacing. He stopped in front of her, his expression one of profound, quiet gratitude. "Ms. Jenkins," he said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. "I'm Rook Thorne." "It's nice to finally meet you, Mr. Thorne," Sarah replied, her voice steady. He shook his head. "Rook is fine. I don't have the words. Breaker told me everything. What you did for my son. What you risked." He looked down at Leo, who was beaming, holding his father's hand. "Thank you for looking after my boy when I couldn't." He held out a thick manila envelope. "This is for you." Sarah immediately held up her hands. "Oh no, I couldn't possibly. I didn't do it for money." "I know," Rook said, his eyes softening. "That's why you deserve it. It's not money." He gently pressed the envelope into her hands. "Just open it later." He swung a leg over his bike, and Leo, his face alight with excitement, climbed onto the passenger seat behind him, his small arms wrapping tightly around the leather vest that was his family's coat of arms. With a final, grateful nod to Sarah, Rook twisted the throttle. The panhead roared to life, the sound no longer a threat, but a promise of protection, a lullaby of loyalty. Sarah watched them ride away, a father and son reunited, disappearing down the long, sun-drenched road. Later that evening, in the quiet of her small, lonely rental house, she opened the envelope. Inside, there was no cash. There was a single, official-looking document. Property deed. The Iron Serpents had pooled their money, bought the dilapidated house she was renting, and had it put entirely in her name. Free and clear. Staring at the legal print, Sarah Jenkins finally let the tears she had been holding back for weeks fall freely. She was no longer an outsider. She wasn't just a teacher in Oakhaven. She was home, sheltered by the fierce, unwavering loyalty of the most unlikely brotherhood she could have ever imagined.